let's talk about assets and the concept of reality versus bullshit.
Okay, I like it.
Saied and I both having been underwriters, I can tell you that we've seen a lot of people's balance sheet. And their balance sheet is typically their assets and their liabilities, right? And you take the assets, which are usually positive things, and their liabilities, which are usually negative things. You subtract the positive from the negative, and whatever's left is your net worth, right? We'll cover that a little bit later, but let's just start with the basic. A lot of people think things are assets that are not assets.
Like what?
So if, for example, you own intellectual property, right? You own a trademark. To you, that might be worth a lot of money. You put that on your balance sheet as an asset. Unless an accountant or an outside auditing firm says there's true intrinsic value in this intellectual property, this thing that you own that's not material or tangible,
Right.
I'm not going to give you credit for that as an asset. I could care less.
Right. If I'm applying for a loan and I say that I own 10% of the Higher Standard podcast, well, they're going to be like, what do you want me to do with that?
Show me the income statement. Show me the balance sheet. Does that have any value to it? If
Right.
it does have value and your accountant says that it does, then I'll give you some 10% of that valuation. But you can't just say everything in the world's an asset. I mean, another favorite one is people go, oh, I've got life insurance.
Yeah, there's always the life insurance policies that people put on there.
And they're like, oh, my cash surrender value is this. And that might be true. It could be whole. It could be term insurance. The differences are not really important for this particular show. But one has a cash surrender value and one does not. Just because your life insurance policy is $1 million doesn't mean I'm going to give you $1 million in asset.
So what is a cash surrender?
So basically, if you turned it in that moment in time, right then and there, how much you would get for surrendering it in cash in return, right? So you might have $1 million policy, but your cash surrender value could be $50,000, right? That would be your asset value. If you could really, truly get that out of it, that would be your value. So there's a lot of people who put my number one pet peeve, and I see this all the time. The old school real estate mortgage brokers do this. They're notorious for this. They'll put your house as an asset. They'll put your car as an asset. And even though it's an appreciating asset, which we'll get into that in a minute, they'll put the value there. They'll just put all these values there, and they'll think, oh, the underwriter will believe it. Then they always put art, rugs, jewelry. They just knock off the price, a couple $100,000.
Personal property.
If I can't verify your asset, if I can't actually tell that it's a real thing that you own, and you're just throwing out bullshit, don't put it on your balance sheet.
Right. As an underwriter, when I get a financial package for a borrower and a list of guarantors, we always get what they believe is their stated net worth, which gives you a breakdown on their balance sheet of everything that they own, from liquid assets to illiquid assets to all their liabilities, which we'll get into in a second here. But it's crazy how much it varies, the difference between the stated column versus what I actually give them credit for, because we only give credit for things that we can actually verify, to your point.
Yeah. My favorite is, I've got a lockbox with diamonds in it, Chris. It's got $2 million in diamonds in it. And you're like,
I have a wine cellar that has this much wine, and you're like,
oh, I've heard that one. Yeah.
Where you're like, you could drink your asset away. That's cool.
My favorite was, I own a highly rare car, and it is a one-of-a-kind, unique collector item, and it is worth $1 million. I've had people say that. One of them owned a Tucker. You know what a Tucker is?
No.
Everyone pull that up real quick for the audience. But a Tucker was a unique car. It's very classic. I think it's like 50s. But it was ahead of its time as far as innovation and technology. And that's actually real. Tucker 48. There you
go. Wow, that's actually beautiful.
Yeah. It basically has three headlights. The center headlight, the third is in the middle, and it actually turns as you turn the wheel.
I've never seen that
before.
before.
The technology was way ahead of its time. But these things are worth $1 million.
Wow.
I have a client that owns 3 of them.
Stop it.
Yeah. Yeah, and he owns a shit ton. This client is so wealthy, this fucking guy. He's gotten so successful and so wealthy that he has a multi-million-dollar car collection. But then he's like, okay, wait a minute. I'm buying all these hyper-rare cars, classic cars that aren't built anymore. He wants to find that needle in the haystack. But he's like, wait a minute. How many cars come out of a factory? Hundreds, thousands? I'm going to start buying the factory signs. There's only like 4 factories, maybe 3, maybe 1 in some cases, and they only have 1 sign on those factories. I'm going to buy those things. So you walk into his facility, and all the old school neon car signs are there. That wasn't enough. He said, you know what? I'm going to buy old gas stations and remodel them and put them in this space, because old gas stations were smaller. So there's this big warehouse, and inside the warehouse, he has old gas stations. But that wasn't enough.
I feel like big warehouse is an understatement.
Oh, it's huge. I'll explain that in a minute. That wasn't enough. He said, I'm going to stock these things with all the vintage things the gas stations had in it. So all the old oil accounts. So we spent tracking on. He's like, you know what? I'm bored with cars. He bought a tank. He got in trouble for driving the tank outside of the warehouse up and down the street, a vintage tank. He has airplanes in this thing.
Wow.
And this is a very unassuming business complex, and it costs so much to run the power in the damn thing that he rarely turns the power on in the full building with the neon and everything else turning on, because he said he's like, I don't want to tell you how much, but it's thousands of dollars an hour just to power it. Yeah.
Sounds like a future remote recording that we need to do.
He won't let very many people in the space because it's not a public collection.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason he let us in the space, frankly, is because we took a lien on the car for a loan for him. And I mean, he has a Mercedes 300 SL, Gullwing, original, all OEM, 1955, I want to say. He has some hyper rare vehicles in space. It's incredible.
So just to break this down quickly, one segment about the assets that we want to get into.
Cutting me off. And
Sorry. There are liquid assets and there are illiquid assets. All that means is the asset itself, how quickly can you turn it into cash, right? The quicker you can turn it into cash makes it more liquid, right? So therefore, cash is actually a very liquid asset, right? You got stocks, bonds, things that you could sell off immediately and they could turn into cash. Mm-hmm. Something that would be viewed as illiquid, right, would be your house or an investment property, right? It's not as liquid. It would take, right? Escrow in and of itself might take 30 days unless you get some type of like cash offer, right? So those are the different variations.
I look at the difference as friction, right? If you could sell something relatively quickly and it's somewhat frictionless, that's a liquid asset, right? If it takes time and there's some challenges in the way that's going to take you some time to move something along, there's some things that may be contingent, like finding a buyer might be a challenge. Mm-hmm. That is typically an illiquid asset, right? The friction in between. If you're selling your car, generally not a liquid asset, right? It's an illiquid asset because you got to find a buyer, place it for sale. There's a process involved in it. Which, by the way, I think this is a good opportunity to talk about two different types of assets. There's appreciating assets and depreciating assets.
There you
go. Cars are typically viewed as a terrible investment, and there are some rare exceptions. Don't be that guy in my DMs. I understand that there's hyper cars, exotic cars, rare cars, all those things. But generally speaking, cars are depreciating assets. They go down in time. The more you use them, the more worn they are. Homes, ironically, the more you use them and the more worn they are, they don't necessarily go down in value. Sometimes they go up.
Even though you are given a depreciation expense.
Yeah, you are given depreciation expense for the improvements, the building on the actual land.
Yeah.
You get it's an interesting thing for tax purposes. It's really political, but that's an appreciating asset. It tends to go up in time. So smart buyers will typically tell you, don't buy depreciating assets, because what you're doing is you're taking your $100,000 that you used to buy this depreciating asset, and you're knowing going into it that it's going down over time. So you're actually losing money. They say buy appreciating assets, where you put $100,000 in something and it's going up over time. Mm-hmm. I tend to look at that as illogical. There are certain costs of living in the world that you just have to accept. The price of playing the game. Having a vehicle in some places that are widespread, it's part of the game. I mean, you probably get away in New York and some other places not having one, especially with Uber now and stuff like that. But generally speaking, there are certain opportunity costs of living life that you have to go into. If you have to micromanage the assets you're buying because you can't afford a depreciating asset, I would say you're probably not making enough money.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And something else to note, depending on the type of loan that you're getting or the different institution that you might be applying for a loan at, they might look at some of these things differently. So even though, your marketable securities, right, your stocks, your bonds, your portfolio, mm-hmm. right, could be viewed as a liquid asset, as an underwriter, I take that and I always account for a potential bear market, or, the stocks eventually could possibly come down. So I discount the value that it's at, right? I know that some departments look at it differently. They give credit for what's stated on the actual